Hey there! In this episode of B.Hooked, I'm so excited today because we're kicking off a brand new knitting series. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be knitting some patterns to help you stock your shop. Now, of course, if you don't have a shop, you can make these. They're great to gift because they're quick and easy to make. You'll have these tutorials to walk you through the entire thing if you're a brand new knitter. Now, before we dive into the tutorial, I want to let you know that you can access the written instructions, all the supplies that you're going to need, the information about the supplies that I'm using, the colorways that I'm using. You can find all of those details on my website. Just head over to bhookedcrochet.com/handwarmers, and you can find all of that information there. All right, now let's roll into part number 1 of projects to stock your shop. We're going to start off our mitts using the long tail cast on. As the name implies, we need a long tail. So what I do, honestly, I just kind of eyeball this. I just get myself a nice long tail. But if you want to kind of measure it out specifically, you can do that by wrapping it around your needle. And each one of these wraps is about the amount of yarn that you need for one stitch. So this ideally should be enough for 4 stitches. So you can take an educated approach, or you can just eyeball it like I do, and then set yourself up for the long tail cast on. We're going to cast on to double pointed needles, and that's because getting a circular needle that's in a 9-inch, honestly, it's difficult to try to find in the size that we need. So 6.5 millimeter needles is what I needed to obtain my gauge, and you just can't find a circular needle in that size. So double pointed needles it is. We're going to use a total of 4. So we're going to cast on 3 needles, and then we'll use that 4th one to work. Okay, so you want to just drape your yarn over your needle and secure that with your finger. Then I'm going to just stick my fingers in and pull it down. Then circle it around, catch that loop on my thumb, swing around, catch the one on my finger. I am going a little bit faster. I'm assuming that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the long tail cast on, but I do have a slower video. If you are brand new to knitting and you're just finding this video first, you may want to go ahead and check out my resource for the long tail cast on. You can find that at bhookedcrochet.com/longtail. So what we want to do for the size that we're making here is cast on 7 stitches per needle. So I have 5 here. I'm going to cast on 2 more. Then grab one of my other needles. I'm just going to jump right into casting on that one. So I'm just going to kind of let this one flop and let it lay there. But I still want to hold my yarn in the same position. So I want to just swing around and grab that same loop that I would on my thumb, and then swing around and grab the one on my finger. And this first one is going to be super awkward, but you'll get the hang of it after a while. You just kind of let that other one hang there in the background. And we're going to cast on 7 stitches to this needle as well. That one, and then we're going to cast on 7 to a 3rd needle. Now let's see how to make this transition one more time. I want to keep my yarn just in my hands as I normally would. So I'm just kind of letting this one sit so it can pull the yarn down. So pull down this middle section here because I want to target this front loop on my thumb. So I have my loop here and here. I'm targeting this one. So I'm going under that loop, and then I'm swinging around, just making sure that this is behind or just out of the way, and grabbing the loop on my finger. Then you'll release your thumb over the tip of the needle and tighten it all up. And again, we're going to do 7 stitches for this needle. Alright, so after you've cast on all 21 of your stitches, you want to orient your double pointed needle so they look like the letter H with your working yarn and your tail over on this side here. The other thing you want to make sure is that all of the little bumps, so what's underneath that cast on, is all facing the same direction here on the bottom of the H. Now I am going to give you a little bit of warning. If this is your first time working with double pointed needles, the first 2 rounds are the worst. So if you can just get through this, I promise you it will get much easier. You'll get the hang of it, and it's worth it. Sometimes you just have to use double pointed needles. You can't get around it, and so this is that great project to learn how to do that with. So I want to take my work and turn it around so that my tail and my working yarn are going to be in my dominant hand. So I'm really just taking it and flipping it upside down from the way that I had it before. We're going to start knitting with this needle right here because this was the first stitch that we casted on. I want to join this last stitch and the first stitch so that I can start working in the round. Now to do that, I'm just going to push that needle down so that I have easy access to it, and I'm going to take my free one here. So I'm going to use my free one and this double pointed needle right here. Those are going to be my 2 active needles, and the other 2 are just placeholders at this point. They're just holding the stitches in place, and we will get to them later. So I'm holding my empty needle right here in my dominant hand, my working needle here, and then I have the working yarn coming from the back on that back needle, and I need to knit the first stitch. So what I want to do, and sometimes I like to just kind of do it with my hand and not try to hold up my yarn like I normally would. Just go ahead and wrap it around that new needle and knit it. And you want to make this one a little bit tight because this is going to be the join between the 2 sides, and it's going to seal things up. So the tighter the stitches, the better. Now everything from here on out is going to be knit stitches. So you're going to master this one, and we're just going around and around, but I want to show you how to actually work with these double pointed needles. So the idea is that we always have 2 that we're working with and 2 that are holding our stitches in the case of this pattern. Sometimes we use 5 DPNs. This time we're just using 4. So we have 2 working, 2 placeholders. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish knitting the remaining 6 stitches on this needle. And I think you'll find too that this goes a lot more smooth when you're working in your lap. If you're trying to work on a table like I am here, your needles are they're gonna bang against the table, and it's going to look a lot more difficult than it actually is. Okay, so I've finished knitting that first needle, then that gives me another free one. So we kind of just swapped places there. If you were paying attention, you saw that this was my other working needle and this was my free one. Well, now we've swapped. So this is my free one. Now I just want to follow the work, and if you need to lay it down to see where things are going, that's perfectly fine. This is my circle. I have my little braid towards the inside. That's how I know it's not twisted. And this was the needle that I ended with. So that means this is the needle I'm going to start knitting with next. So to do that, I'm just going to shove that needle down so that it's kind of in place. But I also want to take these stitches and slide them more towards the middle of that needle. That's going to make sure that they don't fall off. And it's also going to just make all of this easier to hold on to. So then I'm going to take my free needle, find that first stitch, and just start knitting there. Now, one thing I like to do, and when I'm actually not working on a table, this makes a lot more sense. I like to situate this placeholder needle on top. So I'm always working under it at this angle, and it kind of keeps it out of the way. And then I like to make sure that these are actually swapped so that my working needle here is on top, and then this one just kind of hangs there in the background. once you start working with DPNs for a while, you will find a rhythm to all of this. And like I said, these first 2 rounds are always the absolute worst because you just don't have a lot of work to hold on to and you don't have a lot of work to look at. So it's more difficult to see when and where you're supposed to place your needle. So I'm just knitting all of the stitches here on that second needle. And now I'm ready to pick up on the next one. So I really don't have to lay my work down. I can really see that this is the needle I need to go to next. So what I'm going to do is slide these stitches down, and then I'm just going to slide this needle in place. Now once again, I'm just going to situate this little bottom needle so it's underneath and out of my way. And knit all of the stitches on this last needle. So this is what our work looks like now after the first round. And we're really just repeating that last round for a total of 8 rounds. So right now we have 1 row of knitting or 1 round of knitting, and we need to have a total of 8 before we start playing with some color changes. It's going to get a little bit easier from this point now that we have a little bit of work to hold on to. But like I said, it's still going to be quite awkward for just a little bit. Now you can choose to mark the first stitch, and that's really just a visual placeholder so you know when you're at the start of a new round. But honestly, in this case, we really don't have to. I tend to use my needles because I know that I have 7 stitches per needle, and I know that the needle where my tail is coming from is actually my last stitch there. So I choose not to use a stitch marker in this case, but you're more than welcome to. All right, so when you finish knitting one, you're just going to pull the stitches down towards the middle of your needle, kind of rotate your work just a little bit, and pick up with the next needle. So shove those stitches down. Again, I'm going underneath this one here. I'm going to make sure that this one is situated under that as well to knit that first stitch. You can already see how much easier it is for me to kind of hold on to these needles and get working. It really doesn't matter what level of knitter you are. Those first 2 rows, the first 2 rounds are always going to be a little bit wonky and kind of difficult to wrangle. All right, so we finished that needle here. We're going to move to our third one. So I've scooted my stitches here in the middle, and then I'm just going to slide these ones down, get my needles situated so they're under control. And this is my tail here. So this is also how I know that this is my last needle, and my last stitch will be at the end of this round. Now sliding those down, we've completed our second round, and that's the repeat. What I need for you to do at this point is go ahead and knit up 6 more rounds. We're just working with knit stitches here, and when you have a total of 8, then we're going to start changing colors. Now I do want to point out, and there's not much work here to see, but each one of these little V's represents 1 row. So I have my first V right here, that is my first row, or my first round. Then I have my second V right here, which is my second round. And then I'm also going to count what's on my needle as a round in itself. So technically, when you're counting like this, we can count this as a third row. So keep that in mind. You want to have a total of 7 V's in your row, and then you want to, of course, have that round of stitches on your needles. And when you reach that point, we're going to grab color B and start playing with some color transitions. All right, so what I've done off camera is I went ahead and knit up until I could count 7 rows here, and then my 8th row is on my needle, and now I'm ready to start tackling some of those color joins. Now here we see a completed glove, and this is the color pattern repeat. It's really simple. So we've worked up to this point here. We're going to make 1 round in color B, 1 round color A, 1 round color B, 1 round color A, switch back to B, and then we're going to stay with color B throughout the rest of the pattern. And one thing I want to bring to your attention is flipping it over. So this is the right-handed mitt, and this is the right side of the mitt. When I flip it over, the color joins are still nice and tidy, and I'm going to show you the trick to that next. So the first thing I want to do is grab color B. I'm just going to loop it over so that I have about 4 to 5 inches, 6 inches, something along those lines. We just want to have enough to weave it in later. And then I'm going to grab my work, figure out what needle I'm going to start working on, so it's the one that's right next to my working yarn. But I'm not going to trim this color yet because we're just going to switch right back to it after 1 round. So I'm going to make my life a little easier and carry this up the back side. So I will slide my stitches down in place, add in my free needle there, and just loop the new color around that needle and pull it through to knit that stitch. So the act of that joins our new color of yarn. We can drop the tail and then simply start knitting with the working yarn here. You want to be careful as you knit the next stitch because this yarn is a little bit loose because we don't have any knots there in the back. And that's okay. If you want to tie a knot with the initial color A, you can do that. I find that it's easier if I just kind of leave it as it is. And now that we've joined on this new color, I just want to knit every stitch in this round. I do want to stop when I get back to the other side. Now when you get to your last stitch, it is going to be really loose, and that's because we have the working yarn still here at the back. So what I like to do is just pull on that to tighten up that last stitch so it's nice and tidy. And we're going to drop color B. We're going to just be done with that for just a little bit. And the next thing we need to do is correct the jog. First, we need to find the first stitch that we knit with the new color. That's this one right here. And then we're going to look directly below that and find that first pink stitch here in my case. Then I'm going to isolate this leg of that stitch. So you can just use your needle to pick it up and place it on your needle. Now what we're going to do, we're not actually going to use our free needle just yet. We want to take this last one, and things are going to get a little bit uncomfortable here because we have a lot of stitches on this needle and we're trying to kind of force it in this direction, but we're just doing it for this one stitch. So grab the working yarn for color B, and then we're going to just isolate these two here, and we want to knit them together. So I'm inserting my needle knitwise, making sure that I'm catching that gray stitch and the pink stitch, the one that I just pulled up. And then I will knit it over on that last needle. Now from here, I'm going to drop color B, the working yarn for color B, and I'm going to start on the next stripe. So what I want to do there is just grab my free needle, and now I'm just going to have a total of 6 stitches here on this needle, and as we progress through this striped color pattern, we're going to lose a stitch on this needle every time, and we're going to actually gain it over here. And that's okay. What we're actually doing to correct this jog is we're kind of shifting everything over by a few stitches. So don't be alarmed if you're dropping stitches here, or it looks like you're dropping stitches here and you're gaining them here. That's totally normal. Now, go ahead and insert your needle knitwise into your first stitch, and then find the working yarn for color A, and we're going to knit it. And we'll just knit this around completely normal. So just knit every single stitch until you get back around to the beginning here. Now once again, when we get to that last stitch, it's going to be all loose because our working yarn there is just kind of hanging in the background. So give that a tug and it'll tighten up that stitch. And now we're ready to correct that jog again. So in this case, we're going to focus our attention on the first gray stitch that's right below the pink one here in my case. So this is color B, pink is color A. I'm going to grab that leg and then place it up on my needle. And the rule of thumb here, since we're working with 2 colors, is when we're correcting that jog, you want to pick up the color that you last knit with. So just go ahead and look at all of the stitches that are on your needles, and that's the color you're going to pick up for this last stitch. Now you can always kind of twist things and wiggle them. The work is relatively forgiving here at this point, so we can kind of make it do what we want in order to make the stitch a little easier for us. Okay, now that finishes this row, and we can't really tell at this point, but if we kind of straighten things out and look at it here, we can see that there is no jog on this gray piece. And you'll see this more as our work grows a little bit. You'll really be able to see the effects of this method, and it's awesome. This works really great for single stripes. Now the act of just picking up that side leg and putting it on your needle, that is perfect for when you have bigger stripes. So let's say we had a big stripe here and we wanted to transition to the gray and have like a pretty thick portion of that. We wouldn't have to necessarily take the stitch and work it on this needle like we are. All we would do is pick up that leg and then we would knit it together as the first stitch and keep going, and it'll correct that. But since we're just working with single rows here, we have to do things just slightly different. So that is the color repeat. What I need for you to do at this point, so we have our first row of gray, we have our second row or our first row there of the pink color, and we just want to repeat that. So we finished this one and we're just going to repeat one more time. So we're going to switch back to gray and then switch back to the pink, and then we're going to pick up after that. So using the techniques that we've just covered, go ahead and work that color repeat one more time. Okay, so what I've done off camera is I have finished one more color repeat. So I have my gray and I've just finished up my pink row, and before I make my final color transition back to color B, I'm just going to use that same technique to make sure I don't have that jog showing. All right, now once we get a little bit of length, we can play with this too, because sometimes, like you can see, this stitch is kind of getting hidden there, and what we would do is just kind of take one of our other needles and just catch the color that we really want to be shown. So I'm just catching that leg and just pulling on it a little bit so it pulls it out to the front and we can see that. And you'll notice we just have 3 stitches remaining on this needle, and we have basically transferred them over to this one. We'll take care of that in just a little bit. We don't need to worry about it at this point. but I'm going to go ahead and pick up color B and start knitting with it. But we're finished now with color A. So what I can do is just trim that working yarn. And what I like to do is just pull it through the middle so it stays out of my way. And then we're just going to continue knitting. So we're knitting now with color B, and we need to have a total of 4 rounds with color B. So we're just going to count them as we go. And once we have the 4 rounds of color B, then we're ready to start working with our thumb holes, our thumb gusset. And now this is the needle where I have the extra stitches. So what you'll want to do, just take your next free needle and just knit 7 stitches on the free needle. Now what you could do if you're comfortable with it is we can transfer these loops over to this needle here. I'm going to demonstrate one of those here, and if you have a 5th, a lot of DPNs when you buy them they come with a 5th needle. I'm going to show you how you can use that as well. But if you only have 4 to your set, we can just transfer them over, and you just want to do so just like this. So just transfer it from one needle to the next. I'll show that one more time. Pretty easy stuff. But if you want to use a 5th DPN, if the thought of switching your needles kind of scares you, then you can just use your remaining needle to your set, basically by just pretending like it's a brand new needle. And we're just going to knit the remaining 2 stitches. And then I can drop that. I'll no longer use that one anymore. And then just pick up with this needle here. Now your last stitch will again be pretty loose, and that's because we had the tail down here at the bottom, so you can just pull on that. It'll make it nice and tidy, and you can keep going. So from here, everything else is the same. I'm just going to continue working these last few stitches with color B. And now, once again, I have 7 stitches on each one of my needles. I've worked that first round with color B, and I just want to continue on until I have a total of 4. So once again, when you can count 3 V's, basically 3 rows here, and then you'll count the row that is on your needle, you'll count that as your 4th row on our needle. And when you get to that point, then we're going to pick up with the thumb gusset. So this is what our work looks like now after we have completed that color repeat and we have 4 rows worked in color B. The next thing we need to do is set up for our thumb gusset. So the way we're going to do that is just pick up where we were. So I'm going to set up my needle there to knit. I'm going to continue knitting with the same color now throughout the rest of the pattern. And we're going to need a couple of stitch markers. So I've got those there off to the side. And I'm working the pattern for the right-handed mitt. So I'm going to be knitting 15, and it's going to be slightly different for the left hand just because obviously it's the opposite hand. So the thumb placement is going to be opposite from what we'll experience here with the right one, but you can find all of those instructions with the pattern over on my website at bhookedcrochet.com/handwarmers. So I've knit 7 so far. Just slide that up, slide this one down, and I want to knit 15. So basically what that means for me is I'm knitting 2 of my DPNs and then 1 stitch from that 3rd one for the right-handed mitt. And there we go. I've knit 15 stitches, and now what I want to do is set myself up for the increases because we're going to increase our stitch count by 8 stitches over the next several rows in order to create the little thumb space. So what I'm going to do is just use some stitch markers, and any kind of stitch marker will do that is a ring or that you can slide on your needles. And I'm using two different colors because I'm using two different stitches. We're going to do the make one left and the make one right. And the colors just are an easy way for me to remember which stitch I'm supposed to be doing. So to do a make one left, that's going to be the first one. We're going to find the bar that's in between the two stitches. So the stitch that's on our brand new needle and then the stitch that's on our needle over here. We're just going to pick that up and place it on our needle so that it looks like this. Now the make one right is going to be similar, but we're just doing it in the opposite direction. So make sure when you pull up that bar, you're placing it over your needle like that, and that's going to make sure you are doing the make one left. Now what we need to do is find the back loop. So if you look at this stitch, you'll follow this strand all the way around. We can see the back loop back there, and it's a little tight and it's going to be difficult to work your needle into, but honestly, that's how you know that you're doing it correctly. This stitch is not supposed to be easy to work. So you'll slide your needle in there and knit it just like you normally would, and it's going to be a little tighter than normal. You'll knit that and then you can slide that off, but of course don't slide off your next stitch. So then what we're going to do is knit one. So we're going to knit that next stitch. And now we're ready to do our make one right. So we're doing the right and the left because we want there to be kind of a mirror image so that it's increasing in a mirror image or in a way that makes sense. So for the make one right, we're still grabbing that bar in the middle, but instead of placing it on this way, like we just saw, we're actually going to place it on in the opposite direction. So it should look something like this, and we're going to target now the front loop. That's where we want to knit from, and of course this one is going to be tight and difficult to work in too. So what I find is that if I take my finger back here and I pull up the slack on that stitch, I can get my needle into just that front loop. And you can probably even hear that it's a little bit difficult to slide that needle in, but that's how you know you're doing it correctly. Now you'll knit that stitch, and of course it's going to be tight on your needle, but it will work itself out. Don't worry about that. And then we're going to take our remaining stitch marker, just going to lock that up, place that on your needle, and then we're just going to continue to knit for the rest of the row. Now be very careful and hold on to these stitches because with those two increases, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to slide those stitches around. So just be aware of that as you move on, and maybe even take the time to slide them all the way up on your needle in order to kind of create some slack in those stitches. So once you've repeated that last row, that finishes this round. This is an increasing round. We want to just keep track of that as we go along because the next round that we're going to knit is not an increasing round. So all we need to do is knit every single stitch until we get to the end of our round, and then we'll set ourselves up for another increasing round. Now when you make it back around to the needle where you have your stitch markers and those tighter stitches, when you reach your stitch marker, just go ahead and pass it from one needle to the next, and that's going to keep that place, and then we're just going to keep knitting. So just knit all of the stitches, and keep in mind that those increases are going to be a little bit tighter, and just knit them as you normally would with kind of like the same tension that you normally would. And it'll be a little bit more difficult to slide it off, but it's not too big of a deal. Okay, so at this point, we need to get ourselves all the way back around. These stitch markers are going to be our visual cue. Now, we don't really have to count stitches anymore. That's going to be our visual cue to let us know when we need to increase again on this increase round. So what I'm just going to do is knit up to this first stitch marker right here. Now, when you get to the point where you are at your stitch marker, here is going to be your repeat. So what we're going to do when we get to that first one, the orange one in my case, I'm going to pass it over. And then I need to make one left. So that means I'm going to grab that middle bar, place it over my needle, and then wiggle my needle there into that back loop. Now when you reach that other stitch marker, before we pass it over, we want to go ahead and make one right. So grab that middle bar, place it over your needle, and then work your make one right. Now at this point, you can go ahead and pass your stitch marker over and continue knitting until you get to the end of your round. So this is what our mitt looks like now after 2 rows of repeats, and we're going to follow that same pattern 2 more times. So what we need to do next is knit a full round. We're not increasing on the next round, and then we're going to increase, followed by a knit row, followed by an increase, and another knit row. That's the full repeat for the thumb gusset. Once again, you can find those instructions at my website. But the other thing that I want to point out is you really don't have to memorize what you need to do next. We're increasing by 2 stitches every single time we increase. So we started out with just 1 stitch in the middle of those 2 increases in between the make one right and the make one left. Now if you count them after doing 2, we have a total of 5 stitches in between these markers. So on your first increase, you'll have a total of 3 stitches because you're going to get those make one right and make one left in there. At the end of your second increase round, you're going to have a total of 5 stitches. And at the end of the third, you'll have 7. At the end of the fourth, you'll have 9 total. That is our target. You're going to continue this repeat, this 2-row repeat, until we have 9 stitches in between our marker. Then that is going to complete the thumb. At that point, we'll just remove these stitches, hold them, save them for later so that we can pick them up at the end and finish knitting the thumb. So this is what your work looks like now after you finish the thumb gusset repeat, and we're ready now to remove these stitches. And in order to do so, we have to knit back around. So right now I have stopped working at the end of this last round. So this is the round where I did not increase. And just to be certain, you want to make sure that you count 9 stitches in between your 2 stitch markers. That's going to make sure that your thumb gusset or your thumb hole is going to be big enough for your thumb to fit through. Now when you're ready to start transferring your thumb stitches over to a stitch marker, and I've actually switched here to the left-handed mitt to do this demonstration, well, you're going to need some kind of thing to hold your stitches. So this little guy right here is just a standard stitch holder. They come in, but you don't have to use this kind of stitch holder. You can just as easily use a darning needle and a scrap piece of yarn. I would recommend using a contrast color to hold it. That way you can tell which is the holder yarn and what is your actual stitches. That's going to help you when you go to pick them up later. But the basic idea is the same no matter which device you're using to hold the stitches. So I don't need the stitch markers anymore. I'm just going to remove those. And we have to be aware of the direction of our stitches and how they're going on our stitch holder because we don't want our stitches to twist. Now, something that is definitely more difficult to see on camera than probably your own work is that there is some directionality to the stitch. If you look very closely at your own work, and you can almost see the direction here, see how the stitch kind of naturally wants to lean a little bit? Well, that makes it so that this front leg of that stitch, so basically just this front area, is a little more forward than the back leg of that same stitch. So it's kind of shifted in this direction here, and that's the right orientation. We want to make sure that we never twist that unless the pattern indicates, because you will get a different looking stitch if you work a stitch when it's twisted. So with that in mind, we just need to take either our darning needle or our stitch holder and just go straight into the stitch. Now I'm not twisting these. I'm also making sure I don't split the yarn in my stitches and just work it one at a time. So keeping the stitch facing the same direction, I'm just going to slide them off. And again, you would use your darning needle in the same way. Just always go in the same direction when you're sliding them off. That's going to make sure you're not twisting the stitches. Now, if you do end up twisting a stitch, it's really not the end of the world. You can always just twist it back the other way, but this definitely saves you a little bit of time in the long run to make sure they're not twisted when they go on, because then they won't be twisted when they come back off. Now, once you place all 9 thumb stitches on your marker, again, we don't need those stitch markers. We can just, I'm going to secure this up, but if you're using a scrap piece of yarn and a darning needle, of course you want to make sure you have a little bit of leeway, a little bit of extra space on that scrap piece of yarn, and go ahead and tie it in a knot. Now, you don't want to tie it so tight that it's just kind of scrunching things up. The end goal is just to make sure you have a loop, a closed loop, and it's not going to come undone. So if I were to put this down, put it in my project bag or my purse, I know that these stitches are not going to go anywhere because I don't want them to come out. Now, because we're jumping this gap right here, what we need to do is cast on 1 stitch. And we're doing that because remember back to the first round of our thumb gusset increase, we started, and I'm looking all the way down here, we started with a make 1 left, and then we knit 1 stitch, and then we did a make 1 right. Well, that stitch that we knit in between, that was one of our original stitches. So remember back, we have for this size 7 stitches per needle, and if we count what we have left, I have 3 stitches on this needle and 3 stitches on that one. We're short one. Well, we need to make up for that. And the way we do that is take your working yarn and hold it in your non-dominant hand, just like this. Now place your thumb over just the little space here and then flip it around. So you're basically just twisting that on your thumb, and then you're going to take your needle and catch that loop and then pull it tight. Now that is going to act as a normal stitch. So we can just continue on with our pattern. I'm just going to poke this little thumb out so I can have easier access to it and set myself up to knit the next stitch. Now you also notice I have 4 stitches over here, 3 stitches over here, so my stitch count is back to normal. And when I knit this first stitch, because I'm jumping over this gap, I do want to try to make this stitch a little bit more tight than I normally would. The tighter this stitch is, then the tighter the join or the little corner of our thumb is going to be. And there we go. That is all of the difficult work. From here on out, we're just going to finish knitting the length of the hand. And our target length is about 7.5 inches. So what you want to do is continue knitting around and around until it measures about 7 inches from this cast on edge here. So you're just going to measure here. And once we do that, we'll pick up next with the cast off. So once you've finished up knitting the length of your hand warmer, it should look something like this. And the next thing that we're going to do is cast off these live stitches that are on our double pointed needles here. Then we're going to pick up the stitches for the thumb, knit a few rounds, and that's it. So we're just going to do a basic knitting bind off. So I'm just going to set myself up and knit the first 2 stitches just as I normally would. So there's 1 and 2. And then what we're going to do is pass this first stitch here over the second one. So just take your needle and slide it under that first stitch. And I like to pull on it, give it a little tug to get some slack on it, and I secure this stitch with my finger here as I slowly slide the needle out and work it just like this. So then I have just secured that first stitch and I'm ready to knit the next one. So we're always going to be working in these little groups of, we'll have 1 loop on our needle, then we'll have 2. And when we have 2, we're always going to pass the first one over the second one. Then when we have just one loop remaining on our needle, we're going to knit the next one. Pass the first over the second and just repeat this all the way around until you only have one loop remaining. Now, when we have just that last stitch remaining on our needle, we can go ahead and trim our working yarn and leave yourself a tail that's about 5 inches or 6 inches. We need a little bit of slack in order to weave that in. And then I'm simply just going to pull up on that loop, and I'll tidy all of this up later. Okay, so up until this point, we have knit the bulk of our hand warmer. The last thing we need to do is just work on our thumb. The good news is there's only about 3 rounds left. The bad news is we're only working with 9 stitches, so it's going to be a little uncomfortable for all 3 of these rounds. But if you stick with it, the result is really incredible. And so the first thing we need to do is transfer these live stitches from our stitch holder, whether it be one like this or a scrap piece of yarn. We need to transfer it to our double pointed needles. We're going to split these 9 stitches over 3 needles, so 3 stitches on each needle, but we need to do so in a strategic way because we do not want to twist our stitches. So we were very careful with our placement and how we situated them on the marker so that they aren't twisted, and we just need to make sure that we maintain that as we remove them. So I'm going to isolate these first 3 stitches and come at it from this direction and just slide them on my needle, remove them from the stitch holder. And those are all set to go. You'll grab your next needle, isolate your next 3 stitches, then slide them on. And then the last 3. Okay, so we've picked up all 9 of our thumb stitches, and one last thing we need to just observe before we start knitting is the front and the back of the work. So I'm working on my right-handed mitt here, so this is the right side of the work. This is what you're going to see on top, and we want to make sure that this is the most nice and tidy side, right? We want the good part to show. But we do have to join on some new yarn to finish up these stitches, and when we cast off, we will see a little jog like we had here. So we want to try to hide that as best we can, and we're going to do so on the underside of the work. So it will go on your hand like this, so this is going to be what's facing underneath, so you're not going to see it quite as obvious. And so I'm going to choose this as my first stitch to start knitting. Now go ahead and insert your empty DP just directly in that stitch knitwise and grab your working yarn. So actually this is just a new piece of yarn, and fold it over. Leave yourself a tail that's about 4 to 5 inches, something that you can weave in, and just loop that around your needle and pull it through the stitch. So we've just knit the first stitch with our brand new ball of yarn. We can just drop that tail and continue knitting. So go ahead and knit these next 2 stitches, and then I want to show you something new. Okay, so we've knit the stitches for our first needle. Then the next thing we want to do, we're just going to set that aside, is observe this little hole. Now your needles are probably going to be in the way, so just open it up like this. And if we were to just jump from this needle right here, this is our last stitch, this technically would be our next stitch to work. If we did that, so if I hold these 2 together, then you would see this opening right here. And we don't want that. We don't want a hole in our mitt. So we need to pick up a stitch in this space in order to eliminate that hole. Now we're still going to have a tiny hole, but we will fix that when we weave in our ends. But the one thing that we can do to really improve things is to pick up a stitch in between. So honestly, you can pick up and knit wherever you want to, whatever looks the best. That's the main goal here. But what I found is that when I pick up and knit in between two knit rows, that's when I get the best outcome. So I have a knit row right here, and I have a knit row right there. And so I just want to stick my needle in between there. Try to catch 2 loops if you can. And then just take your working yarn, loop it around, and pull it through. And so I've just picked up 1 stitch in that space. And now if I pull up on that, see how it closes that gap? It looks pretty nice. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm not going to use this needle anymore because I have 4 stitches on there now, and things will get a little uncomfortable if I continue to use it. So pick up your free needle and get yourself situated to knit on the next one. And while you're working this stitch right here, just knit this one a little tighter than you normally would. And that's because we are kind of bridging that gap between the 2 needles and between the little thumb crease. And the tighter we can get that, the better it's going to look. All right, so we're just going to continue knitting until we get to the end of this round. All right, now there we go. We've finished knitting our first round. What I want to do is just take this tail because it's kind of in my way. Just pull that through the inside. You just get it out of your way so you don't accidentally start knitting with it because it's now long enough to finish a round. So we'll get that out of the way. And we just want to knit 1 more round. Just knit every stitch. Super simple. Okay, now once you've powered through, you've knit that last round, we just have 1 more, and that is our cast off. We're just going to do this the same as the cast off for the hand. So that means we're going to start by knitting the first 2 stitches and pass that first stitch over the second. Knit the next stitch, pass it over. And you'll just do this all the way around. All right, so once you get finished with that, then we can trim our yarn. Again, leave yourself a tail that's about 4 to 5 inches. And then just pull that through. And the last thing we're going to do is weave in all of our ends. Okay, so this is what our hand warmer looks like at this point. And there are a few little things that we need to fix, a few little imperfections we need to iron out as we're weaving in our ends. So of course we want to correct the jog there. That's actually a little less obvious because of its placement, but we do need to correct that. But then if you look at the thumb, you can see where this joint is a little loose there, and then up here at the top, we do have still just a tiny little hole from the thumb crease, and we can fix all of that with the weaving on our ends. We don't have to worry. We don't have to rip it out or try again. These things are completely normal. So go ahead and turn your mitt inside out. Then grab your darning needle. Let's first address the cast off edge here up at the top. Now looking at it from this direction here, there we go, just get it situated. We can see that this is obviously the higher side, this is the lower side. So I want to pull it down in this direction to kind of match that a little bit more. And what I want to do is just find that first stitch on this lower row. I'm going to try to work my darning needle under both legs of that little V that we see there and pull that through. And now flip it over and find, so this is the tail right here. If I pull that, you can see, and then you can see the V that's right behind it. We're kind of doing an invisible join or an invisible seam here. Just stick your darning needle in between those 2 legs of that V or of that stitch and pull it through. And when we do, what we've done is we've created another V. So this was the first stitch from the end of the round, and this right here was the first stitch of the beginning of the round, and we've created this, and that has given us a nice, clean, and visible join. We no longer have that jog where this side is higher than that one. And then all we have to do is weave this in. All right, now what I'm going to do is just kind of work it down one row. And then just start weaving it in. So I'm just going to pick a little edge, kind of work it under that, and loop it around. And you can work in one direction for a few stitches, and then maybe jump down a row, working back in the other direction. Now once you're certain your end is nice and secure, we can just go ahead and trim it off. And repeat that same thing for the thumb. Then of course we can move on to where we have our color joins, which of course don't look as clean on the inside as they do the outside. And just do the best you can to weave in the color along the color. That way it doesn't show through. Now, if you end up with having a couple of holes in your little thumb crease here, don't worry about that. All we need to do is just take some scrap piece of yarn, or you can use your ends if you haven't already woven them in. I'm going to demonstrate with a scrap piece of yarn just so you can see how it's done. So the first thing you'll do is just isolate the first hole that you want to take care of and just start weaving in this tail or this new little piece of yarn. And the idea is really just to fill this gap. So I want to kind of go in one direction and come out the other, catching two loops and then going back up through this area here because that's where the hole is. Now what I'm going to do is just tie this off and then I'll weave them in, or you can just trim them off if you're not too concerned with having some knots inside your work. Now if you loved these hand warmers, I think you're really going to love next week's project. Next week we're going to be tackling a cabled mug cozy. And yes, hold on to your hats for that one because cables are nothing to fret about. They're easy once you get the hang of it, and you're going to see that with next week's project. So make a few hand warmers and be prepared for that brand new pattern to come out 1 week from today. The last thing I would ask of you, I would be super grateful if you liked this video. Just go ahead and hit the like button. It's really easy. And if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the B.Hooked YouTube channel and tap that notification bell so that you can be alerted the next time we come out with a brand new video. Specifically, the one that's going to be coming at you next week, that cabled mug cozy. So stay tuned for that and for future episodes of B.Hooked. On behalf of my sponsor, Red Heart, and of course, B.Hooked. I'm your host, Brittany, and I can't wait to serve you next week. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. All right, now let's roll into part number 1 of projects to start your shop. To start your shop. To stock your shop.